The whispers reached him before the music did. Standing alone at the edge of the great mirrored ballroom, the Duke of Deverell heard them travel the length of the room like a draft under a door. There he is, the ruined one. They say he cannot even dance now, and he kept his face still, because a soldier learns to keep his face still, and a duke learns it twice over. Nathaniel Crane, Duke of Deverell, had come home from the war 18 months ago with a saber scar down the left side of his jaw, and a leg that had been broken and set badly under fire and never healed straight, so that he walked now with a cane and a slow, deliberate gait that cost him more than any of the glittering people watching him would ever guess. He had been before the war one of the most sought-after men in England, tall, dark, rich, and whole. He had ridden to hounds and danced till dawn and been fought over by half the mothers in 3 counties. He had come back a different creature, and society, which had adored the whole man, did not know what to do with the broken one, and so it did what society always does with what it cannot place. It mocked him, gently, cruelly, behind its fans. He had not wanted to come tonight. The invitation to the royal ball had been a command more than a courtesy, and one did not refuse a royal command, and so he had put on his dark evening clothes and pinned on the 2 medals he had earned and detested, and he had come. And he had taken up a position against the far wall where he might watch and not be watched, and he had been wrong about the last part, because everyone was watching and no one was speaking to him. "They say the king only invited him out of pity," murmured a woman in primrose silk, not troubling to lower her voice quite enough. "One does feel for him, of course, but it is rather awkward, is it not, to have him stand there like a monument to something no one wishes to remember." "He was so handsome once," sighed her companion. "Such a waste." Nathaniel heard every word. He had learned, in a field hospital where men screamed through the nights, that one could hear a great deal and betray nothing, and so he stood, and his hand rested light on the silver head of his cane, and his dark eyes moved over the dancers with an expression that gave away no more than a shut gate gives away a garden. Inside the gate it was another matter. Inside, he was counting the minutes until he might decently leave, and he was thinking that he had faced cavalry charges with a steadier heart than he faced this scented, smiling, murderous room. It was then that he noticed the girl with the tray. She was a servant, one of the household maids pressed into service for the great occasion, in a plain dark gown and a white apron, carrying a tray of untouched champagne with the careful concentration of someone who has been told exactly once that a single dropped glass would cost her a week's wages. She was young, perhaps 22, with fair hair pinned severely back, and a face that would have been unremarkable in the crowd of jeweled beauties save for one thing. She was not looking at the Duke of Deverell the way the others looked at him. She was looking at him the way one looks at a person. He caught her eye by accident, across the width of the room, and instead of the swift, embarrassed glance away that he had grown used to, the flinch, the pity, the sliding of the gaze down to the cane and hurriedly up again, she simply looked back at him steadily for a moment, and then very slightly she inclined her head. Not the deep, obsequious bob of a servant to a duke, a small, grave nod of one soul acknowledging another, and then she went on with her tray. Nathaniel found, to his own surprise, that he was still looking at the place where she had been for some seconds after she had gone. The music changed. The master of ceremonies announced a quadrille, and the floor filled with silk and satin, and the bright, cruel laughter of people who had never in their lives had to be brave, and Nathaniel Crane stood against his wall and watched them dance the dance he could no longer dance, and felt the old grief close over him like water. He had loved dancing once. It seemed a small thing to have lost, beside the men he had buried, and yet it was the small things he had found that undid a man at midnight. Deverell, a hand clapped his shoulder. Lord Percival Anstey, an old acquaintance from before, florid now and half drunk, with the particular cruelty of a weak man who wishes to seem strong before an audience. "Good God, man, you look like a corpse propped up at his own wake. Why do you not sit? There are chairs for the," he laughed, "for the infirm along the wall. No shame in it. We all understand." A little knot of listeners had gathered, sensing sport. Nathaniel felt their eyes. "I am quite comfortable standing, thank you," he said. His voice was low and even, the voice of a man who had given orders under fire. Are you? Anstey's smile widened. Only I wondered, forgive me, whether you can still manage it long. They say the leg's near useless, damned bad luck. Still, one supposes a man in your condition must be grateful merely to be upright. The dancing days are behind you, eh? Behind us all one day, but sooner for some. He turned to his audience, pleased with himself. We must be gentle with our wounded heroes. Give them a chair and a rug and a fond memory of the men they used to be. The listeners tittered. It was exactly calibrated, not quite an insult one could call out, wrapped in false kindness, designed to make a proud man small before a crowd. Nathaniel had met the type on both sides of the channel. He said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not make it worse, and he fixed his eyes on the middle distance and endured, as he had endured worse, and told himself that in an hour he would be home, and that the opinion of Percival Anstey was worth less than the mud he had marched through. But something in him had gone very cold and very still, the way it went before a charge, and he knew that if he stood there one moment longer he would either say something unforgivable or let them see, at last, what their kindness cost him, and he could not permit either. He turned to go, and a voice, clear and quiet and quite unafraid, said, "Your Grace, would you honor me with the next dance?" The whole knot of people went silent. Nathaniel turned. It was the girl with the tray. She had set it down somewhere. Her hands were empty now and folded before her apron, and she was standing in the middle of the polished floor where no servant had any business standing, looking up at the Duke of Deverell with color high in her cheeks and her chin lifted and terror in her eyes, and not one particle of it in her voice. For a moment no one breathed. It was an impossible thing she had done, a maid, a servant, addressing a duke, asking him to dance, breaking every rule of precedence and place and decorum in a royal ballroom before half the peerage of England. It could cost her her position. It could cost her worse. Lady Anstey's mouth had fallen open. Somewhere a fan snapped shut like a pistol shot. Nathaniel looked at her. He looked at the fear she was mastering and the courage it was costing her and the reason she was doing it, which was written plainly in the way she had placed herself between him and the sniggering crowd, a slip of a girl in a servant's apron, shielding a wounded duke with nothing but her own body and her own nerve. "I cannot dance, I am afraid," he said, and he was surprised at how gentle his own voice came out. "My leg, you will have heard, everyone has heard." "I have heard a great deal of nonsense tonight, Your Grace," the girl said steadily, "and I have decided not to believe any of it. I do not think a man dances with his leg. I think he dances with his partner, and I should be very glad of the honor if you are willing to be patient with a partner who has never danced a step in a room like this in her life and will very likely tread on your foot." Something moved in Nathaniel Crane's chest that had not moved in 18 months. "What is your name?" he asked. "Eleanor, Your Grace, Eleanor Shaw." "Miss Shaw." The Duke of Deverell shifted his cane to his left hand and held out his right, and across the whole silent, staring, scandalized ballroom, he inclined his head to a housemaid with the same grave courtesy he would have shown a princess. "The honor would be entirely mine." The music had stopped between sets. Now the leader of the little orchestra, an old man who had played at court for 40 years and had seen a great many things, looked at the Duke and the maid standing in the middle of the floor, and looked at the frozen, appalled faces of the fine people all around, and made a decision of his own. He lifted his bow. He did not strike up a quadrille, which needs many couples and much moving about. He struck up instead a slow waltz, a simple, stately, forgiving thing, all gentle turns and small steps, the kind of dance a man might manage with a bad leg and a cane and a great deal of care. Nathaniel understood the kindness of it at once, and was grateful, and did not show it. He drew Eleanor Shaw into the waltz frame, his right hand at her waist, her hand light and trembling in his, her other hand resting on the arm that did not hold the cane, for he had not surrendered the cane and could not, and she seemed to understand this without being told, and adjusted herself to it, taking a little of his weight without ever seeming to, so that to the watching room it looked less like a man leaning on a girl and more like two people simply holding one another up. And they danced. It was not graceful. He would not pretend afterward that it had been graceful. He moved slowly, deliberately, turning her in small, careful arcs, his bad leg dragging a fraction on each turn, his jaw set with the concentration of a man doing a hard thing well. She was clumsy and earnest and stepped on his foot twice and apologized both times in a fierce whisper and gripped his hand so hard he could feel her pulse hammering. But they danced. Around and around the great mirrored floor, alone, watched by the whole of society, a wounded duke and a housemaid, moving together to a slow waltz played by an old man who understood. "You are shaking, Miss Shaw," Nathaniel said quietly, so only she could hear. "I am terrified, Your Grace," she said, equally quietly and with a flash of something that was almost humor. "I expect I shall be dismissed before morning and possibly imprisoned, and my mother will be very cross with me, and I find I do not care in the least." "Why did you do it?" he asked. It was the only question that mattered. You risked everything for a stranger, for a man who cannot even remember your face in a fortnight most likely. Why? Eleanor Shaw was quiet for a turn of the waltz. When she spoke, her voice had lost its tremor. "Because my brother came home from the war too," she said. "The same war. He came home without his right arm and half of what he used to be, and he could not find work because who wants a one-armed clerk, and he sat in our mother's kitchen for 2 years growing smaller and smaller while people who had never left England told him what a shame it was and how brave and moved along quickly so they need not look at him. And he died last winter, Your Grace. Not of his wound. Of being made to feel that his wound was all anyone would ever see. Of being pitied to death by people who thought pity was the same as kindness." Her chin came up. "And then I stood in that corner tonight holding my tray and I watched them do it to you. The same thing. Exactly the same thing. That man telling you to sit down with the infirm and everyone laughing and you standing there so straight and so alone, and I thought, no, not this time, not while I have breath. I could not save my brother. But I would be damned before I would stand and hold a tray and watch it happen to another good man in front of me and do nothing." Nathaniel Crane, Duke of Deverell, who had not wept when they set his broken leg and had not wept at the graves of better men than himself, felt his throat close so hard he could not speak for a moment, and had to look away, over her head, at the blur of watching faces, until he had command of himself again. "Your brother," he said at last roughly, "what was his name?" "Thomas." "Then we shall dance this one for Thomas," said the Duke, "if you will permit it. And you will not be dismissed, Miss Shaw. You have my word on it, and my word is not nothing, whatever they may say of the rest of me." They finished the waltz. When the last note faded, the ballroom was utterly silent, a silence with something uncertain in it now, something shifting, for it is one thing to sneer at a wounded man standing alone and quite another to sneer at him after you have watched a serving girl place herself between him and your cruelty and dance with him with tears standing in her eyes. Some of the watchers had the grace to look ashamed. Percival Anstey had gone a dull red and was studying the floor. And then, from the far end of the room, a single pair of hands began to clap. It was an old woman in the dowager's chair by the great fireplace. The Dowager Countess of Marbeck, 80 years old, sharp as a blade, who had buried 2 sons in earlier wars and outlived every fool in the room and cared nothing at all for what anyone thought of her. She clapped slowly and deliberately, her rings flashing, her old eyes fixed on the Duke and the Maid with fierce approval. And after a stunned moment another pair of hands joined her, and then another, and then, because a crowd will follow courage once someone braver has shown the way, the applause spread across the great room like a fire catching, until the whole ballroom that had mocked the Duke of Deverell was on its feet applauding him, and the girl who had stood with him. And something none of them could quite have named, but all of them, in that moment felt. Nathaniel stood in the middle of it with Eleanor Shaw's hand still in his, and did not let go. He kept his word, better than his word. Before the night was out he had spoken privately with his hostess and with Eleanor's employer, and by the terms he set, terms no one cared to refuse a duke, especially a duke the whole room had just applauded. Eleanor Shaw was released from service into a position of his own devising. He would not have her a maid. He offered her, first, a place assisting the steward's wife at Deverell, at a wage that made her weep, and she took it and came north. But that, he knew even as he arranged it, was a fiction, a decent excuse, a way to have her near without frightening her with the truth. The truth was simpler and had struck him somewhere in the middle of a slow waltz played for a dead soldier named Thomas. The truth was that he had been dying by inches for 18 months in a world that saw only his wound, and a girl with a tray had looked at him and seen a man, and had staked everything she had on the strength of that seeing, and he was not going to let her walk back out of his life into the crowd. She lived at Deverell through the spring, and Nathaniel, who had shut himself away for a year and a half, found reasons to be wherever she was. He learned that she read everything she could reach, and had taught herself Latin from her dead brother's old school books. He learned that she was not afraid of his scar and did not look away from it, and that when he was in pain, for the leg was often bad, on cold days worst of all, she did not fuss or pity, but simply arranged quietly that the fire in whatever room he used was built up higher, and said nothing about it, and let him keep his dignity. He learned that she laughed easily once she was not afraid, and that her laugh did something to the shut, cold place inside him that 18 months of solitude had not touched. Not everyone at Deverell was glad of her. There was an under-steward, a pinch superior man named Grigg, who had served the old Duke and thought he knew the natural order of things, and who made it his quiet business to remind Eleanor Shaw at every turn that she was a jumped-up housemaid who had danced her way above her station, and would soon enough be found out. He gave her the meanest room in the servants' wing. He contrived that her wages were paid late. He let it be known, in the pointed way of such men, that a young woman who won a duke's notice by making a spectacle of herself in a ballroom was not the sort a respectable household could be easy about. Eleanor bore it without complaint and said nothing to Nathaniel, because she had a horror of seeming to trade on his regard, and because she had learned in a hard life that a woman who runs to a powerful man with every grievance soon has no dignity left of her own. But Nathaniel missed very little where she was concerned, and when he found her one gray morning scrubbing a hearth that was no part of her work set to it, he learned, by Grigg, as a lesson in humility. He went very quiet in the way that had once made colonels nervous. He did not rage. He assembled the household in the great hall that afternoon, every servant from the steward to the boot boy, and he stood before them, leaning on his cane, and he said, in a voice that carried without being raised, "Miss Shaw came to this house because on a night when a room full of my equals thought it fine sport to mock a wounded man to his face, she alone of all of them, and a servant with everything to lose, set down her tray and stood at my side. There is not a soul under this roof, and I include myself with half her courage. Any person in my employ who offers her anything but respect offers it to me and may seek a situation elsewhere by nightfall. I trust I am understood." He looked once at Grigg, who had gone the color of tallow. "I believe I am." Grigg sought a situation elsewhere by nightfall. Eleanor, when she heard of the speech, was torn between mortification and a warmth she could not put down, and she came to find the Duke in the library, and told him rather severely that she had not needed rescuing, that she had been managing Grigg quite well, and that he must not go about defending her honor before the entire household like something out of a bad novel. "You did not need rescuing," Nathaniel agreed gravely. "You never do. That is rather the trouble with you, Miss Shaw. It leaves a man who would very much like to be of some use to you with almost nothing to do." And she had laughed despite herself, and the awkwardness had melted, and it was after that, and easier after that, that he began to tell her the things he had told no one. There was a particular evening toward the end of that spring that Nathaniel would remember all his life. A great storm had come down off the moors, the sort that rattles the old glass in its frames and sends the servants scurrying, and with the change in the weather the pain in his leg had risen to a height he had not known since the surgeon's tent. He had shut himself in the small study, where no one might see, and set his jaw against it and been surprised, some while later, by a soft knock. It was Eleanor. She did not exclaim or fuss, or wear the anxious, pitying face he braced himself against. She came in with a basin of hot water and cloths wrung out and steaming, and a small stoppered bottle of something her grandmother had made, she said, for a fisherman's aches, and she set them down and looked at him quite matter-of-factly and said, "You are white as the tablecloth, and you have been gripping that chair for an hour, and I will not pretend I have not noticed, because pretending would insult us both. I have nursed a man in pain before. I know how it is done, and I know how not to make a great tragedy of it. Will you let me?" And Nathaniel Crane, who had never let anyone tend the leg since the army surgeons, who had guarded his wound like a shameful secret for 18 months, found that he could not refuse her, not because he was too weak, but because there was nothing in her face he needed to guard against. So he let her. She worked the hot cloths and the ointment into the knotted muscle with strong, sure hands and steady talk of ordinary things, the storm and the roses and a foolish letter from her mother. And slowly the fist of pain unclenched, and he lay back in the chair with his eyes shut and something in him he had held rigid for a year and a half finally, cautiously, let go. "There," she said when it was done, and her voice had gone gentle in a way she did not permit it in daylight. "It will ease now. It always eases in the end if someone is only willing to sit with it and not run away." She was quiet a moment. "That is the whole trick of it, I have found, not the ointment, the not running away." He opened his eyes and looked at her kneeling by his chair in the lamplight, sleeves pushed back, the storm at the windows, her plain, honest face soft with a tenderness she thought he could not see. And it was then, more than at the dancing, more than at any words, that Nathaniel Crane knew past all doubt that he loved her, and that he would never in his life run away from anything again, so long as she was willing to sit with him through it. He said none of it then. He was not ready, and neither, he judged, was she. But he reached down once and covered her working hand with his own and held it, just for a moment, and she went still and did not pull away, and the storm rolled on over the moors, and in the small warm study, a wounded man and the girl who had never pitied him sat in a silence that said everything neither of them yet had the courage to speak. He told her about the war, the mud, the field hospital, the friends he had carried out and the ones he had not been able to. He showed her the leg one evening plainly without drama, so that there should be no mystery in it and no shame, the badly set bone and the long scar, and she looked at it steadily and then looked up at him and said, "It is the leg of a man who stood when he could have run. I do not see anything in it to pity, Your Grace, and I never did." And Nathaniel Crane understood in that moment that he loved her, entirely and without hope of recovery, and had loved her most likely since she set down her tray. He did not speak of it for a long while. He was afraid, a man who had faced cannon was afraid, that she had come to him out of that same fierce compassion that had made her dance with him, a duty owed to her brother's memory and paid to the nearest wounded man, and that beneath the friendship there was only kindness, and that if he spoke of love he would frighten her away or, worse, trap her by his rank into a gratitude she would mistake for feeling. So he said nothing and grew quietly wretched with the not saying, until a leaner, who missed very little, cornered him one evening in the library. "You have been avoiding me for a week," she said without preamble. "You go silent when I come into a room and you find urgent business elsewhere, and yesterday you fairly fled the conservatory when I came to cut the roses. I am not a fool, Your Grace, whatever my birth. If I have done something to offend you, I would rather you told me plainly than treated me like a ghost you are trying not to see." Nathaniel set down the book he had not been reading. He looked at her, standing there fierce and uncertain in the lamplight, and he thought that he had never in his life met anyone so brave, and that a coward's silence was a poor way to repay it. "You have not offended me," he said. "The reverse. I have been avoiding you, Miss Shaw, because I am in love with you, and I did not know how to be near you without saying so, and I did not wish to say so because I could not bear for you to feel that my rank obliged you to a feeling you do not have. You came to me out of compassion. You danced with me for your brother's sake and stayed to be kind to a broken man, and I will not turn your kindness into a cage. So I said nothing. And in saying nothing I have made you think I was displeased with you, which is the last thing on this earth I am. There, now you have it plainly." Eleanor Shaw stood very still. The color came up in her face as it had that first night in the ballroom. "You great, brave, blind fool of a man," she said, and her voice shook. "You think I danced with you for Thomas. Did you not?" "I stood up for you for Thomas," she said. "That is a different thing. I put myself between you and those laughing people because of my brother, yes, because I could not bear it. But I danced with you, Nathaniel Crane, and I stepped on your foot twice, and I gripped your hand till my knuckles ached, and I looked up into your face while that old man played us a waltz. And somewhere in the second turn of it, I stopped dancing for Thomas and started dancing for myself. Because I had never in my life felt so much like a person as I did with your hand at my waist and your eyes on mine, treating a housemaid like she was the only woman in a room full of duchesses. I have loved you since before I knew your Christian name. I stayed at Deverell because I could not make myself leave. And I have spent this whole wretched week thinking you had realized what I was, a servant, a nobody, a girl who forgot her place and repented of ever bringing me here. A tear spilled over. So do not tell me about compassion, your grace. I know the difference between pity and love better than most, God knows, and what I feel for you is not pity. For a moment the Duke of Deverell could not move. Then he crossed the room to her slowly, with his cane, in the halting, deliberate gait that no longer, when she was watching, felt to him like a thing to be ashamed of, and he set the cane aside, and he took both her hands in both of his. Then I will ask you a second time, he said, the question I asked you in the ballroom, though I mean something rather larger by it now. Miss Shaw, Eleanor, would you honor me for the rest of my life and yours with the next dance and every day between? I have never danced a step in a room like this in my life, Eleanor whispered, laughing and crying at once, and I shall very likely tread on your foot. I am counting on it, said Nathaniel Crane and kissed her. They were married at Deverell that summer, and the Dowager Countess of Marbeck, who had begun the applause, came all the way north in her ancient carriage to see it done, and pronounced the new Duchess the only sensible woman to enter that family in 60 years. Society, which had mocked the wounded Duke, discovered within a season that it had always thought the match the most romantic in England, that it had personally admired the Duke of Deverell's courage all along, and found the story of the brave girl who danced with him quite the most touching thing it had ever heard. Nathaniel let them think what they liked. He had learned in a harder school than any ballroom what the applause of a crowd was worth and what it was not. He danced at his own wedding. It was slow and it was careful, and he leaned on his bride more than a little, and no one who saw it ever forgot it. Percival Anstey was not invited. His leg never healed straight, and there were cold days to the end of his life when it pained him and he needed the cane and the fire built high. But he was never again, in all the years that followed, a man defined by his wound, for he had married a woman who had looked past it before she ever knew his name, who saw a soldier where others saw a cripple and a man where others saw a monument, and who reminded him, in 10,000 small unspoken ways across a long and happy life, that a man does not dance with his leg. He dances with his partner, and Nathaniel Crane, Duke of Deverell, danced with his to the end of his days and counted himself, wound and all, the most fortunate man in England.